Although America has big financial problems, in Europe, things are worse. This riot was in Greece. Greece has had the most riots, but there have been big fights in Spain, Portugal, England. The protesters blame austerity.
It's just a terrible situation, only cuts, cuts, cuts.
Cuts, cuts, cuts. Yes, it must be terrible there. All this budget slashing is unethical experimentation on human beings, says Paul Krugman. He and many others say Europe's troubles prove the free market argument is wrong. And I admit the Europe struggles gave me pause. I see stories about Europe with headlines like, "The economic argument is over. Paul Krugman has won." Could it be true? Cato economist Dan Mitchell has studied European austerity. Why haven't the budget cuts worked?
Because there haven't been any. That woman from England who you just quoted, government spending has gone up in the United Kingdom every single year for at least a couple of decades, and even since the so-called Conservative Party government took over a couple of years ago. Not only that, it's rising faster than inflation. You look at France, government spending's been going up.
We have a graph of some of these countries. France, Italy, United Kingdom, Spain.
All these countries were increasing government spending at a rapid rate. And then all of a sudden, the fiscal financial crisis hit. Oh, we have to do something. We have to do austerity. But what they meant by austerity wasn't, let's prune back the size of this bloated public sector. They said, let's raise taxes. So all these countries were raising taxes, driving their private sectors into the dirt with these punitive class warfare tax hikes. That didn't work. And so now, finally, as you said, in Greece, we're seeing a tiny bit of spending cuts only because they've reached the end of the rope. They can't get more bailouts. They still can't borrow from the private sector. They've raised taxes to the point where even the IMF said there are Laffer curve responses, you'll get less revenue. So amazingly, it's like, hallelujah, the Greeks have finally, when they tried everything else and it failed, they made a tiny, tiny spending cut.
But why all this publicity about draconian cuts? And people there experiencing it believe it.
Here's the problem. The fight in Europe is between the so-called austerity crowd and the growth crowd, but the growth crowd are really the Paul Krugman, Keynesian big spender types who think government spending is some sort of magic elixir that you throw it onto the economy, it grows. And the austerity people, well, the IMF and whatnot, they just want higher taxes. There's nobody in Europe who's actually advancing the position that Senator Rand Paul was talking about and some others are talking about in the U.S. of we have a big, expensive, inefficient government. If we want more growth, we need to shrink the burden of government spending. And it doesn't matter whether you finance government with taxes or borrowing. It's the transfer of resources from the private sector to the government. That's what hurts your economy.
Because government has no money of its own. It has to take it from the private economy.
Yes, and in all likelihood, they're not going to spend the money as efficiently.
And the coverage is so insane. The Atlantic, that's a respectable magazine. My nephew's the editor. And yet, Atlantic editor Matthew O'Brien, that's not my nephew, someone else, the more a country has cut, the more unemployment it has. A recovery is worth a deficit.
I bet he probably also agrees with Paul Krugman and somehow thinks that more government spending will help an economy, even though it didn't work for Hoover and Roosevelt in the 30s, it didn't work for Japan in the 90s, didn't work for Bush in 2008, didn't work for Obama in 2009. It's never worked anywhere.
But people believe.
Politicians love the theory because it tells them that their vice is a virtue.
Oh, and they like to spend.
Oh, you're telling me that it's good for the economy if I go out and give money to all these interest groups that are helping my campaign? Oh, yeah, I'm with you. I'll be first in line.
Any good examples? Any country that's done it right?
I just got back from Europe, got off the plane today, came here because this show is the best place to be.
Definitely.
The Baltic countries, most people don't even know where they are. Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, they've actually done the right thing. When the fiscal financial crisis hit in 2008, they actually cut government spending. And when I say cut government spending, I'm not talking about the Washington thing. Oh, we increased spending at 6% instead of 8%, so that's a 2% cut. No, in the Baltic countries, spending was actually lower in 2009 than it was in 2008, then it was lower again in 2010 than it was in 2009.
And those economies are growing.
Those economies are growing. They've recovered. Jobs are coming back. They have positive GDP. In other words, economic growth, while the countries that have gone with the tax increase approach, like Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, et cetera, they're in a recession. In other words, the moral of the story is you have to figure out ways to reduce the burden of government spending and taxes, and most countries in Europe haven't done that. The Baltics are a tiny glimmer of good news.
And back on this continent, just one last example. Years back in the 90s, Canada made big cuts, real cuts, and prospered. The Canadian dollar was worth 70-some cents at the time. Now it's has parity with our dollar. It works.
That's amazing, and most of those spending cuts and actual, genuine, real spending cuts in Canada happened under a Labour Party government.
A liberal government,
yeah,
because only the liberals can get this stuff through.
New Zealand did the same thing in the 1990s, and when these countries, and actually, to be fair, Bill Clinton was much better than a lot of Republicans. At least he restrained the growth of spending. Of course, Republicans in Congress played a big role in that, too.
Made him do it.
But the good news is, the evidence shows if you at least restrain the growth of government, or even better, actually cut government spending, you're freeing up resources for the productive sector of the economy, and that's where you get growth. We have to focus on taking government, which is this big giant blob now, and somehow figuring out how to at least restrict it so that it's growing slower than the private sector.
Well, good luck with that. Dan Mitchell. We're back with your questions for Cato economist Dan Mitchell. Also, Russ Roberts and John Popola, who made the Hayek versus Keynes rap videos. So first, from my Facebook page, Joshua Bailey says, has anyone defined any endgame principles when deciding what programs to fund and what to cut?
What it boils down to is core public goods. Things like rule of law and property rights are good for an economy, and that type of government spending is helpful. Some type of physical and human capital spending, roads, education, can be good if the government does it efficiently. That's a big challenge. But the bulk of budgets today, whether you're talking about Europe or the U.S., are for what's called transfer or consumption spending. And the evidence is that kind of spending diverts resources from far more productive uses. And if you're going to do a cost-benefit test, I don't want to sound like a boring economist, but if you really care about economic growth, you want to do that cost-benefit test, and the transfer consumption spending, we should figure out ways to constrain those types of outlays.
And just dump on the poor and the helpless and not help them? That's what these transfer payments are supposed to be.
Well, the theory is that if you get your private sector growing, the poor will be much, much better off with a prosperous private sector. You'd much rather be poor in Hong Kong or Singapore because you have a good future rather than being poor in France or some country like that, where the best you can hope for is that the politicians will forever pat you on the head and keep you a dependent ward of the state.
Yes, sir.
People now more than ever, I think, are graduating from university into a terrible job market, usually having received a degree in something that's not really going to help them in the job market. Do you think that this poor job market is reflective of just a bad economy, or do you think that there's a fundamental problem with our educational system and how we educate our college students?
Well, it's a personal choice what people major in. If you want to major in something that's not very profitable, that's your choice. And I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't see anything wrong with studying beautiful things of Western civilization. Poetry makes you a better father, I think, but might not help you get a job. So you do have to take that into account, but that's your choice. I think that's
your
the way it
choice.
should be. So it should be, but we also shouldn't be subsidizing as much as we do right now, which is we're subsidizing people taking some things that aren't really very practical, and that means that the people who are making those choices aren't using their own money. So I think that's the mistake.
Yes, go ahead.
No one has brought up the entitlements. I don't see how they can be sustained. And government, city, any of those employees that get lifetime health insurance and pensions, where's the money coming from?
On the federal government level, it's all about Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and it's really the first two, the health care entitlements. Now, the good news, normally I'm filled with gloom and doom, but the good news is the House of Representatives in 2011, 2012, and then earlier this year, they voted for entitlement reform of both Medicaid and Medicare in a fairly serious substantive way. And they got reelected in 2012, and I don't think they're suffering at all from casting those tough votes. So I think the American people have sobered up. I think they've realized, looking at the calamity in Europe, that we have to address these long-run fiscal problems of excessive government and unrestrained entitlement. So for once in my life, I'm going to sound optimistic.
Those of us that are called Austarians or that think that the government should be smaller, a lot of times we don't talk about that we believe civil society should be larger. And when you look back to American history, what you find is there was a rich civil society that took care of our brother. These organizations, not only did they provide the sorts of benefits that we now rely on faceless bureaucracies to do, but they did it in such a way that was both local and held people to account, because you looked your brother in the face, and if he went and bought a plasma screen TV while he was claiming he was unemployed, you know, it's a little harder to do that when you know the people that are supporting you. So I think there's more to this than just what we're going to cut. It's what we're going to allow to emerge after that.
And just to counter your optimism from Twitter, boring file clerk says, isn't it true that this austerity will only go on to hurt the poor and the needy?
Well, government spending doesn't really go, very much of it goes to the poor. We like to think it does, but most of government spending goes to rich and middle class people.
Well, food stamps, Medicaid.
That's a tiny portion of government spending. We have lots of things we can cut before we get to the poor. We could cut corporate welfare. We could cut some of these entitlement programs we've been talking about that go to rich people. Why should everybody contribute to Social Security and everybody gets money back? Let's reserve those programs for the people who are poor. It's nuts to pay for people's health care and their retirement who are able.
But Russ, Keynes said that Social Security is good because it encourages people not to save. So
Yeah.
isn't that the stimulus? We don't need to save. The government saves for us, and then we get more spending.
Sarcasm is what that is.
He's a genius.
Who's next?
Gentlemen, if a government is deemed irresponsible because of rampant spending, what is your solution to that same government deciding responsibly what to cut and what not to?
That's a great question.
You know, well, we often talk about the government as if it's a person who decides. You just use the word the government decides. Of course, there's no single decider in Washington, D.C. It's a emergent process of 535 members of Congress and the Senate, and then you throw in the president, you got the agencies that they all work with. It's not a logical process. It often works pretty well. We do better than a lot of other countries. But yes, it's a struggle. I would like to see the Constitution, remember that little thing we had a few hundred years ago, play a bigger role in what government's allowed to do and not allowed to do. And that would, I think, restrain government in the correct way.
Well, thank you, Dan, Russ, and John.